Richard froze when the sound of a suitcase slammed against the floor upstairs, echoing through the old Springfield house like a gunshot. At 67, his instincts screamed trouble, and climbing the stairs confirmed it. David, his only son, was cramming clothes into a travel bag with the panic of a man on the run, mumbling about a business trip that everyone knew was a lie. The sight of his son abandoning the home where generations had lived hit like betrayal carved into bone. But what Richard didn't know yet was that this suitcase carried more than clothes. It carried the end of everything he thought was safe. Before we continue, make sure to subscribe and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. The glass cracked like a gunshot across the hardwood floor, shards glittering under the thin light of late afternoon. Richard's eyes went straight to the picture face down on the ground, the one that had rested on that dresser since the day Helen died. It was her smile, frozen in time, holding their newborn grandson, Ethan, against her chest. A frame kissed goodnight for more than a decade. That photo had survived birthdays, holidays, the silence of grief, and the relentless wear of years. Now it lay broken, and his son David, the boy he had once carried on his shoulders, stepped over it without a glance. Something inside Richard's chest twisted, a sharp ache that felt older than his bones. His heart seemed to protest not just the careless act, but the coldness it revealed. He saw no hesitation, no guilt in David's eyes, only a kind of ruthless determination that made him wonder how long this stranger had been living in his son's skin. Richard bent down, the ache in his knees forgotten as his trembling fingers brushed the broken edges of the glass. Helen's face stared up at him, unmarred by the crack, still radiating the warmth that had kept him alive after she was gone. He remembered the night sitting by her hospital bed, her voice whispering promises that their son would never be alone, that Richard would be strong enough to carry both grief and duty. He had believed it. He had believed David would heal. Now, watching his son jam socks and shirts into the suitcase like a thief in his own home, he felt the truth cut deeper than any shard. David wasn't healing. He was running, and in that flight he had already trampled everything sacred. "David, stop!" Richard's voice broke through the air, steady but strained. He wanted to hold his son still, to rewind the moment, to force some sliver of recognition back into those tired eyes. But David barely paused, his jaw tight, his hands moving faster. "Talk to me," Richard said again, desperation hiding beneath the firmness. "What's really happening here?" For a fraction of a second, David looked at him, and in that gaze Richard found nothing familiar. It was as if the boy, who had once clung to his mother's skirts, who had played ball in the yard with unshakable laughter, had vanished completely. Instead, there was only a man emptied of warmth, filled with some strange relief in abandoning everything that had once defined him. "I'm leaving," David muttered, his voice flat, stripped of affection. "I should have done this years ago." The words landed like a physical blow, driving air from Richard's lungs. He steadied himself on the dresser, glass crunching faintly under his shoes. The photo frame now nothing but a symbol of everything slipping away. His mind flooded with memory. Helen's funeral, the years afterward when David spiraled into silence, when Richard stepped into the role of both father and mother for Ethan. Every dinner, every parent-teacher conference, every scraped knee and sleepless night. It had been Richard who answered the call. He had done it gladly, believing that holding the family together was a way to honor Helen's last breath. And all this time, David had been counting the minutes until he could walk away. "What about Ethan?" Richard asked, his voice breaking in places he could not control. He had promised Helen that the boy would never feel abandoned, that he would always know family stood firm, even when the world crumbled. David zipped the suitcase with a final snap that echoed like a verdict. "He's better off with you," he said without flinching. "He always has been. You've been his real parent since day one. Now it's official." Richard stared at his son. the words cutting deeper than any insult. It was not gratitude. It was not love. It was dismissal, casual cruelty wrapped in resignation. The boy he had raised had reduced him to a placeholder, a stand-in for the duties he never wanted to face. David shouldered the suitcase and brushed past him, the scent of cologne mixed with stale exhaustion trailing in his wake. "David, please," Richard tried one last time, his hand grasping at his son's arm. The connection was brief, cold, shrugged off as though a stranger had touched him. "Whatever's wrong, we can work through it. We are a family." But David's laugh, low and bitter, carried no trace of recognition. "There is no family, Dad. There's just you and Ethan pretending, while I pay the bills. Well, now you can figure out how to pay them yourself." The words drained the warmth from Richard's body, leaving him rooted in place as David marched down the stairs. Each footstep pounded like a nail sealing a coffin. Richard followed, his slippers catching on the worn carpet, his voice unable to find shape anymore. In the living room, Ethan sat at the old oak desk, pencil in hand, algebra book open. The boy looked up, his young eyes already too wise, and saw the suitcase before he saw the fear in his grandfather's face. "Going somewhere, Dad." Ethan's voice was calm, almost clinical, as if he had already braced for this day. David hesitated for the briefest moment, staring at the son who mirrored both his youth and Helen's quiet strength. But the hesitation evaporated. "I need some time away, buddy. Your grandpa will take care of you." "For how long?" Ethan asked, his tone steady, his face unreadable. "I don't know yet." Richard saw the acceptance in his grandson's nod, a quiet surrender that broke his heart more than tears ever could. No pleading, no desperate grasp for a father's love, only resignation, as if Ethan had already written this ending in his own mind. The boy closed his algebra book with meticulous care, stacking it neatly on the desk. Then he looked at Richard with an expression that did not belong to a child. "Don't worry, Grandpa, I'll handle this." The certainty in Ethan's tone startled Richard, striking somewhere between pride and fear. He wanted to laugh at the absurdity of it. How could a 13-year-old handle the collapse of a family? Yet something in that voice, calm and deliberate, silenced him. David opened the front door, letting October air sweep into the house. "I'll call when I'm settled," he said, not turning back. "Where are you going?" Richard asked, his voice barely a whisper. "Somewhere I can breathe again." The door clicked shut, softer than a slam but somehow louder in meaning, as if the house itself had exhaled its last hope. Through the window, Richard watched his son load the suitcase into the back of the silver Honda, watched the car pull away from the curb where Ethan had learned to ride his bike, watched the taillights fade into a future that no longer included them. The silence that followed pressed heavy against the walls. The grandfather clock ticked steadily, the furnace hummed to life, but none of it softened the absence. Ethan's voice broke through, quiet but sharp. "Is he coming back?" Richard turned to him, torn between protecting the boy with a lie and honoring him with the truth. He saw Helen in those brown eyes, the same depth, the same unflinching honesty. "I don't think so," Richard said softly. Ethan nodded once, expression firm, and gathered his books with precision. The boy, who should have been shielded from betrayal, was instead staring it in the face with composure beyond his years. "I'll need to check our bank accounts," Ethan said suddenly, his voice steady, almost detached. Richard blinked, confusion giving way to dread. A child should not speak of bank accounts, of savings, of the fragile numbers that measured a life's work. Yet Ethan climbed the stairs with purpose, leaving Richard in a living room that felt cavernous and empty. Richard lowered himself into Helen's old armchair, the fabric worn by her touch, and pressed his palms against his face. He tried to breathe, but the air felt heavy, thick with loss. The image of David stepping over Helen's broken photograph burned in his mind, more haunting than the sound of the suitcase or the click of the door. That picture had been a promise, a reminder of what they had built together, what she had left behind for him to guard. Now, shattered glass glinted in the corner of the room, reflecting nothing but the emptiness David had chosen. He thought of Helen's last words, whispered between shallow breaths. "Take care of them. Don't let him lose himself." Richard had taken those words as a commandment, the guiding star of his years as both father and grandfather. And yet here he sat, staring at the evidence of his failure. He had not kept David. He had not prevented the unraveling. All he had left was Ethan, and even that boy now carried burdens no child should carry. The house groaned with its age, the wind pressing faintly against the windows, and Richard felt a cold realization sink into him. Tonight would not be the hardest night. The hardest was still coming, carried on Ethan's strange calmness, on the quiet certainty in his young voice. Because if David had stolen more than his absence, if he had taken what Richard had built over decades, then the battle had only begun. And in that battle, Richard feared the most chilling question of all. What exactly had his grandson already discovered? Should have left years ago. The words cut sharper than any blade, slipping between ribs and lodging deep where no hand could reach. Richard stood frozen, his breath stalled in his throat, staring at the son he had carried in his arms, the boy whose first baseball game still lived in his memory like sunlight. Now that boy was gone, replaced by a man whose voice carried no love, no hesitation, only a merciless conviction to sever ties that once held them together. It felt as if someone had swung a hammer into the foundation of the house itself, and cracks were racing through the walls of his soul. Richard leaned against the dresser to keep from staggering. His mind scrambled for words, for sense, for some thread that might unravel this madness. But all he found was silence pressing against his chest. Years of sacrifice, years of holding the family together after Helen's death, of raising Ethan with the devotion of both father and mother, now dismissed in a single cold sentence. His son looked at him not with anger, not even with pity, but with a distance that made Richard feel like a stranger standing in his own home. The suitcase loomed at the foot of the bed, half-zipped, clothes spilling like entrails from a wound. David's hands moved without pause, stuffing shirts, toiletries, anything within reach. Each item crammed into the bag felt like a piece of family life ripped away, torn loose from memory and history. Richard's voice finally clawed its way out, but it sounded brittle, almost foreign. "David, what are you saying? What about Ethan? What about your responsibility?" David barely looked up. "He's better with you. He always has been. I'm done pretending." Pretending. The word echoed in Richard's ears, heavy with contempt. Pretending? Every night spent at Ethan's bedside when nightmares tore through his sleep, every scraped knee bandaged, every meal cooked from dwindling savings. It was no pretense. It was survival. It was love. And yet David stood there, dismissing it all as though Richard's devotion had been some hollow performance. Richard's chest ached, not with age, but with a sudden weight of betrayal so raw it threatened to bring him to his knees. He saw flashes of Helen in his mind. Her smile, her tired hands folding laundry late at night, her whisper as she pressed their newborn into his arms. "Promise me you'll protect them." He had promised, and for years he believed he had kept that vow. But how did a father protect a son who had chosen to walk away? "I don't understand," Richard said, his voice a low rasp. "We have weathered everything. We've carried each other through loss. Why now? Why this?" David snapped the zipper closed with a finality that made Richard flinch. He shouldered the suitcase and met his father's eyes. But there was no recognition in that stare. "Because I can't breathe here. Because this house is nothing but ghosts and obligations. because I should have left the day she died." The words landed with brutal precision, reopening wounds Richard thought had long scarred over. Helen's death was still a shadow that lingered in every hallway, in every piece of furniture she had touched. To hear his son frame her memory as the moment life ended, not for her, but for him, was a cruelty Richard had not expected. "Obligations?" Richard repeated, disbelief threading through his tone. "Your son is not an obligation. He is flesh of your flesh, Helen's legacy, your own blood. How dare you speak of him as if he were a chain?" David's jaw tightened, his grip on the suitcase handle turning his knuckles white. "I didn't ask for this life. I didn't ask to be trapped in a house where every corner whispers about a woman I lost and a family I never wanted to raise. You did this, Dad. You stepped in, you made yourself the savior, and now you can keep the title. I'm finished." The ground seemed to tilt beneath Richard's feet. His vision blurred, not with age, but with disbelief so sharp it stung. He wanted to shout, to shake sense into the man standing before him, but his throat locked around the weight of grief and anger. The boy he had once lifted onto his shoulders to watch fireworks, who had clung to his hand crossing the street, was now spitting venom at him like a stranger. Richard reached out, gripping David's arm with trembling fingers. "Listen to yourself. You're tearing apart the very thing your mother begged me to protect. You're throwing away your own son." For a fleeting moment, David's mask cracked. His eyes flickered with something, regret maybe or hesitation, but it vanished as quickly as it appeared. He shook off Richard's grip with a sharp motion. "You'll manage. You always do. And don't look at me like I've killed someone. This is survival. Mine." The words struck like iron, final and unyielding. Richard felt his chest tighten, every heartbeat hammering with the truth. Nothing he said would change this. The fracture had been coming for years, hidden beneath silence, masked by routine, and now it had split open in the ugliest of ways. Downstairs, the faint scratching of pencil against paper reminded Richard that Ethan was still there, oblivious to the storm unraveling above him. That boy, so young and yet so aware, would soon have to face the empty space his father was about to leave behind. Richard's stomach turned at the thought. He could bear his own heartbreak, but to watch Ethan's innocence dissolve under the weight of abandonment, that was unbearable. David pulled the suitcase off the bed and walked toward the door without another word. The sound of his footsteps echoed down the narrow hall, each one pounding against Richard's chest like a countdown to the moment everything collapsed. Richard followed, driven not by hope, but by the desperate need to witness, to at least be present as his family cracked apart. At the top of the stairs, Richard caught the faintest glimpse of Ethan through the banister, his head bent over his algebra book, unaware of the storm seconds from breaking. Richard's heart twisted. He opened his mouth, but the words tangled in his throat. How could he prepare the boy for this? How could he soften the blow when he himself was still reeling? David reached the front door, his hand on the knob. He paused, turning back just once. For an instant, Richard searched his son's face for some sign, some flicker of the boy who once ran barefoot through the yard, who once clung to his father's side after Helen's funeral. But there was nothing left. Only a man carved hollow by choices Richard could no longer comprehend. "I'll call when I'm settled," David said flatly. "Where are you going?" Richard asked, his voice barely more than a whisper. David's mouth twitched in something like a smile, but it was bitter, empty. "Somewhere I can finally breathe." The door opened, letting in a rush of October air that smelled of dying leaves and endings. It closed softly behind him, not a slam, but the sound resonated like a gunshot in the silence that followed. Richard stood in the entryway, staring at the empty space where his son had just stood, the echo of his words still ricocheting in his chest. He felt the weight of failure pressed down, heavier than the years, heavier than grief. His eyes lifted to Ethan, who had looked up from his desk, his young face calm, unreadable. The boy's gaze met his, steady and unflinching. "Is he coming back?" Ethan asked, his voice quiet, almost detached, as though he already knew the answer. Richard wanted to lie, to shield him, but Helen's eyes in that boy's face demanded the truth. "I don't think so," he said softly. Ethan nodded once, closing his book with deliberate care, stacking it neatly as though control over the smallest details could keep the world from unraveling. Then, with a voice that carried no tremor, he said, "Don't worry, Grandpa. I'll handle this." The certainty in those words startled Richard. They weren't spoken with bravado or childish defiance, but with calm conviction, the kind that belonged to someone older, someone weathered. For the first time since the suitcase hit the floor, Richard felt the ground shift again, not from collapse, but from something rising, something he couldn't yet name. And deep in his chest, past the ache and the betrayal, a question formed, chilling and electric. What exactly did this 13-year-old boy mean when he said he would handle it? The words hit harder than the slammed suitcase, harder than the broken glass of Helen's photograph on the floor. David's voice was steady, almost casual, when he declared it, as though he were signing away an old piece of furniture instead of a living, breathing child. "He's better off with you. You've been his real parent since day one. Now it's official." Richard stood rooted to the floor, every muscle in his body tightening under the weight of the cruelty. His son's voice carried no shame, no hesitation, just a cold finality that carved deeper than any knife. The ache that rose inside Richard wasn't just pain. It was the slow collapse of years, decades of sacrifices, moments when he had carried his son through grief, moments when he had believed that beneath the silence and distance, some part of David still cared. That illusion shattered now. With one sentence, his role as a father was erased, downgraded to nothing but a placeholder who had filled the gap while David wandered in shadows. To hear his own child dismiss him like that was to feel the ground shift violently under his feet. Richard's breath caught in his chest. He wanted to rage, to roar, to drag his son back into the reality of what it meant to be a parent. But all that came out was a hoarse whisper. "You're his father, David. That can't be erased, no matter what you say." David's lips curled into something between a smirk and a sneer. "Father? Fathers stay. Fathers protect. You're the one who's been doing that, not me. And I won't keep living this lie. You've been raising Ethan all along, so just keep doing it. He doesn't need me. He never did." Richard felt the air leave his lungs. The dismissal was complete. His son wasn't just leaving. He was rewriting history, rewriting identity itself. Every scraped knee that Richard had bandaged, every nightmare he had soothed, every parent-teacher meeting, every baseball game cheered from the stands, all of it David now labeled as proof of Richard's place, not David's. In those words lay a perverse logic, that absence was permission, that neglect became justification. He saw Ethan's face in his mind, the boy's quiet eyes that mirrored Helen's, the way he tried to hide how much his father's distance hurt. Richard thought of the promises he had made at Helen's bedside, promises to carry their son through, to never let Ethan feel abandoned. And now, here in this moment, the man who should have shared that burden had not only abandoned it, but mocked Richard for carrying it. The rage that swelled in Richard's chest was tempered by sorrow, but he refused to let it choke him. He stepped closer, his eyes burning into his son's. "You think you've handed him off to me like some unwanted responsibility. But what you've really done is reveal yourself. You are walking away, not because you can't be a father, but because you never wanted to be one. And one day, David, You'll have to live with the knowledge that your son needed you, and you chose the door instead." For a moment, something flickered across David's face. It wasn't guilt, not fully, but a shadow of discomfort, a recognition, perhaps, of the depth of his cruelty. But then it was gone, replaced with that same cold detachment that had been building for years. He tightened his grip on the suitcase handle and shook his head. "Save your lectures. I've made my decision." The door creaked as he moved toward it, and Richard felt the swell of panic rise. He wanted to grab his son, to pull him back by force, to stop the unraveling of everything they had built. But the weight of futility anchored him in place. He knew deep down that David was already gone, long before this night. The man before him was only the final manifestation of years of absence, resentment, and bitterness. From the living room, the sound of Ethan's pencil scratching across paper carried faintly upward, a fragile reminder of innocence untouched, for now. Richard's heart cracked with the knowledge that in mere minutes that innocence would shatter too. He thought of the boy's face when he learned that his father had walked away, when he realized that the man who should have been his protector had instead discarded him like excess baggage. Richard gripped the stair rail as David descended. The house, with all its creaks and sighs, seemed to lean in on itself, bearing witness to the fracture tearing through its walls. At the bottom, Ethan looked up, his dark eyes flicking from his father's suitcase to his grandfather's pale face. The boy asked, steady but cautious, "Going somewhere, Dad?" David hesitated, and for a heartbeat Richard dared to hope. But then his son's voice came, flat and final. "I need some time away. Grandpa will take care of you." Ethan's expression didn't falter. No pleading, no tears, just a slow nod as if he had already braced for this inevitability. Richard felt a cold wave wash over him. The boy's silence was not acceptance. It was resignation, the kind that belonged to someone far older than 13. Richard's throat tightened. He wanted to shield Ethan, to absorb all the hurt that was about to fall. But before he could speak, Ethan said quietly, "Don't worry, Grandpa. I'll handle this." The calm conviction in those words sent a shiver through Richard. It wasn't bravado. It wasn't denial. It was something else, an assurance that came from knowledge Richard didn't yet understand. He stared at the boy, struck by the strange composure etched into his young face. It was too still, too sure, and it left Richard with a question more unsettling than the emptiness David had left behind. Because if Ethan believed he could handle it, the only question left was this: what exactly did he mean by that? The front door stood half open, letting the October air spill into the house, crisp and sharp, carrying the scent of dying leaves. David's hand lingered on the knob, suitcase heavy at his side. His son's voice cut through the silence, steady, unshaken. "How long will you be gone?" Ethan asked, his words not breaking, not trembling, but laid out with the calmness of someone who already knew the answer. David's shoulders tightened as if the question had weight, and for a heartbeat the world seemed to pause. Then he spoke, flat, detached, like a man brushing off an inconvenience. "I don't know yet." That was all, nothing more. No promise of return, no reassurance, not even the decency of a goodbye that meant something. Just uncertainty tossed into the air like scraps from a table, leaving father and son standing on opposite sides of a gulf that would never close again. Richard watched, his chest twisting with every second, wishing he could intercept the moment, cushion the blow, force David to take back what he'd said. But David didn't even meet his son's eyes for long. He simply turned, pulling the door wider, the suitcase scraping against the threshold as if announcing his final step out of their lives. Ethan didn't chase him. He didn't beg, didn't even flinch. The boy simply reached for the book he had left on the desk, closed it with deliberate care, and stacked it neatly as though order might fill the void chaos had left behind. Richard's heart wrenched at the sight. That calmness was not strength. It was survival. It was the quiet surrender of someone too young to bear such abandonment, yet forced to carry it with the dignity of silence. Through the window, Richard's eyes followed the silver Honda as it pulled away from the curb, the taillights glowing red for an instant before vanishing into the night. The engine faded, leaving behind a silence too thick, too heavy. It pressed against the walls, the floorboards, the very air in his lungs. Ethan stood in that silence, his expression unreadable, his hands resting on the pile of books as if grounding himself in the smallest fragment of routine. Richard's instinct was to reach out, to hold him, to promise him the things his father had failed to say. But something in Ethan's posture stopped him. The boy looked steady, collected, as though his heart had already been preparing for this fracture long before the suitcase appeared. Richard swallowed hard. He could feel Helen's absence like a wound tearing open again. She had been the glue, the one who held them together, and her death had left Richard clutching a promise to protect what remained. Now he was staring at the proof of his failure, watching his son vanish into the night, while his grandson bore the weight of that betrayal in silence. He longed to shout after David, to drag him back, to demand that he face the boy he was leaving behind. But his body refused to move, his voice locked inside his chest. All he could do was stand there, watching Ethan's silence echo louder than any scream. Finally, Richard forced himself to breathe. He stepped toward the boy, his voice low, almost trembling. "He's not coming back, Ethan. Not soon. Maybe not ever." The words felt like poison in his mouth, but he knew lies would cut deeper than the truth. Ethan didn't react, not with tears or anger. He simply nodded once, a small, deliberate motion that carried the weight of a man twice his age. Richard saw it then, the quiet resignation etched into his grandson's face, the look of someone who had already counted on this ending, who had built up walls long before they were needed. The boy picked up his pencil again, but he didn't write. He simply rolled it between his fingers, his gaze fixed on the empty chair across the room where his father had briefly stood. Richard couldn't bear it. He walked to the armchair near the window, lowering himself slowly, the springs groaning under his weight. His eyes lingered on Ethan, studying the boy's stillness, the way his jaw clenched just slightly, betraying the storm raging beneath the calm. Richard wanted to tell him it was okay to cry, to shout, to rage against the injustice. But Ethan remained quiet, and Richard, exhausted, could only sit in silence with him. Outside, the wind rattled the windows. The grandfather clock in the corner ticked with merciless steadiness, marking each second of absence. Richard stared at the photo of Helen still cracked on the floor upstairs, imagined her voice in this moment. She would not have stood in silence. She would have gone to Ethan, lifted his chin, told him that love doesn't disappear because one person walks away. But Richard was not Helen. His grief was heavier, his words slower, and the years had carved into him a restraint that kept him from breaking open. Ethan finally rose from the desk. He gathered his books in his arms, moving with quiet precision, and looked at his grandfather. His voice was calm, his expression steady, but his words carried something chilling in their certainty. "Don't worry, Grandpa. I'll handle this." Richard's heart jolted. The boy didn't sound like a child trying to comfort an adult. He sounded like someone who had already mapped a plan, someone who had already decided that if no one else would protect the family, he would. Richard wanted to ask what he meant, wanted to press him, but the weight of exhaustion pinned him in place. He simply nodded, too afraid to disturb the fragile shield his grandson had built for himself. That night, the house felt cavernous. Richard lay awake, staring at the ceiling, listening to the sounds that filled the darkness. the hum of the furnace, the distant creak of old wood settling, the faint scratch of pencil against paper from Ethan's room long after midnight. He closed his eyes, picturing the boy's face again, the calmness that didn't belong to someone so young. And for the first time, Richard felt something shift beneath his grief. It wasn't hope. It was curiosity, sharpened and unsettling. Because if Ethan truly believed he could handle what came next, then Richard had to wonder what exactly his grandson already knew and how far he was willing to go to prove it. The words slipped from Ethan's lips with a steadiness that didn't belong to a boy of 13. "Don't worry, Grandpa. I'll handle this." He didn't raise his voice, didn't puff his chest like a child trying to mimic a man. It was quiet, assured, almost chilling in its calm. Richard froze where he stood, his body aching from the weight of the night. And for a moment he wondered if he had misheard. But Ethan's eyes held steady, unblinking, carrying a certainty that felt older than his years. It was the kind of voice Richard had heard in men who had survived wars, men who had seen enough darkness to understand that silence was sometimes stronger than rage. Something stirred inside him, an odd mix of fear and fragile hope. He wanted to believe those words, wanted to cling to them like a rope thrown across the abyss David had left behind. But the absurdity of it gnawed at him. How could a 13-year-old possibly handle the kind of betrayal that had gutted their family? Richard studied his grandson's face, trying to find cracks in the composure, some tremor of the child that surely still lived beneath. Yet all he saw was that quiet determination, the set of the jaw, the steady gaze. For the first time since the suitcase slammed to the floor, Richard felt something other than despair. It wasn't peace, not yet, but it was a flicker of belief that maybe, just maybe, they weren't as powerless as he thought. He lowered himself into the armchair, his knees protesting, his heart heavy. The house hummed around them, the furnace pushing warm air through vents that rattled faintly, the grandfather clock ticking in merciless rhythm. David's absence still hung in every corner, but Ethan's words lingered louder. Richard remembered Helen's last breath, her whispered plea to protect their son and grandson, to keep the family together. He had failed one, but perhaps the other was stronger than either of them had realized. "Ethan," Richard said carefully, "what do you mean by that?" The boy glanced at him, then back down at the neat stack of books in front of him. His expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes. "I'll make sure we're okay," he answered simply. It was not an explanation, not really. It was a vow. Richard wanted to press him further, but instinct told him to stop. This wasn't bravado. This wasn't a child making empty promises. It was something else, something deliberate. And though Richard didn't understand it yet, he sensed that pushing would only drive Ethan's thoughts deeper underground. So he stayed quiet, letting the words settle between them like stones laid in a foundation. That night, Richard lay awake in his bed, the house stretching vast and empty around him. Sleep refused to come. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw David stepping over Helen's shattered photograph, saw the suitcase disappearing out the door, saw the taillights fading into the night. But more than that, he heard Ethan's voice again and again, steady and unyielding. "I'll handle this." Near midnight, Richard sat up, listening. At first there was only the faint hum of the furnace, the soft creak of old wood. Then he caught it, the rhythmic tapping of keys. It came from down the hall, from Ethan's room. Richard frowned, pulling his robe tighter around him, and stepped into the hallway. The glow of light spilled faintly from beneath Ethan's door. He knocked gently. "Ethan, it's late, son." "Come in, Grandpa," came the reply, calm, unhurried. Richard pushed the door open and stopped in the threshold. Ethan sat at his desk, still fully dressed, papers spread across the surface like a map of something Richard couldn't quite decipher. His laptop glowed in the dim light, multiple windows open, lines of numbers and emails scattered across the screen. His grandson didn't look up right away, his fingers moving with focus too precise for a boy who should have been dreaming of baseball or comic books. "What are you doing?" Richard asked, his voice rough with both curiosity and unease. "Research," Ethan said simply, pointing at the scattered papers. "I've been looking into Dad's accounts, his emails, his movements. I wanted to understand what's really going on." Richard stepped inside slowly, his heart pounding. He looked at the papers, bank statements, credit reports, documents with their family name on them. His throat tightened. "Ethan, where did you get these?" "Dad's not careful with his passwords." Ethan clicked into another window. "He uses the same one for everything. Mom's name, the year they got married. I just logged in. It's not hacking if he left the door wide open." Richard stared at him, at the confidence, the clarity in his voice. His legs felt unsteady, and he lowered himself into the chair beside the desk. The boy handed him a printed statement, numbers blurring before his eyes until one detail sharpened with terrifying clarity. His life savings reduced to $12. He blinked hard, hoping it was a mistake. "This can't be right," he whispered. "It's right," Ethan said quietly. "He's been draining the accounts for months." The words hit Richard like a blow to the gut. He thought of Helen's voice again, her insistence that their family would endure, that David would find his way. Now, sitting in his grandson's room, staring at proof of betrayal printed in black and white, he realized just how wrong she had been. And yet, Ethan's presence, his certainty, kept Richard from collapsing under the weight of it. "What about your college fund?" Richard asked, dread thick in his voice. "Gone," Ethan answered, pulling up another statement. "Transferred to his account 3 weeks ago, then moved somewhere else." Richard gripped the edge of the desk, his pulse hammering. The betrayal wasn't just against him, it was against Ethan, against the boy's future, against the very foundation of their family. He wanted to rage, to tear the house apart in fury, but Ethan's steady tone pulled him back. "I've been following everything," the boy said, his eyes sharp, his voice low. "Dad's working with someone. A woman named Veronica. She's helping him move money, create accounts, hide the transfers. They've been planning this for months." Richard's stomach dropped. "How do you know?" Ethan clicked again, showing him email conversations, screenshots, evidence meticulously organized. "Because I've been watching. I've been documenting everything. I've built a file, proof of every move he's made." Richard leaned back in the chair, the room spinning around him. His grandson, the boy he thought he was shielding from the storm, had been standing in the middle of it all along, eyes wide open, collecting evidence like a soldier preparing for battle. "Ethan," Richard whispered, his voice trembling with both awe and fear, "what are you going to do with all of this?" Ethan looked at him then, and in those eyes Richard saw not the fragility of a boy, but the steel of someone who had already chosen his path. His voice was calm, steady, the same as before. "I told you, Grandpa, I'll handle this." And in that moment, Richard realized the flicker of hope he had felt earlier was not misplaced. It was dangerous, it was unsettling, but it was real. Because his grandson wasn't just promising survival, he was promising a reckoning. And the only question left, the one that clawed at Richard's chest as the glow of the laptop lit Ethan's face, was just how far the boy was willing to go to make it happen. The sound reached him first, faint but steady, like rain tapping against glass. Richard stirred in bed, the clock glowing past midnight on the dresser. At first, he thought it was the house settling, the old beams sighing under years of weight. But as the seconds stretched, he realized it was keystrokes, rapid, purposeful, coming from down the hall. His stomach tightened. Slowly, he pulled on his robe and slipped into the hallway. each board beneath his slippers creaking in protest. The light seeping out from under Ethan's door was too bright for the hour, and the clicking of the keys carried the rhythm of focus, not of a boy sneaking late-night games. He knocked once, gently. "Ethan, it's past midnight." "Come in, Grandpa," came the reply, calm, almost expectant. Richard pushed open the door and froze. Ethan sat at his desk, the glow of his laptop illuminating his young face. Too sharp, too serious for 13. Papers were spread across the desk in organized chaos. Statements, printouts, pages filled with numbers Richard couldn't immediately process. The boy didn't look up, his fingers still flying across the keyboard with the confidence of someone far older. "What are you doing?" Richard asked, voice rough, wary. "Research," Ethan said simply, eyes still fixed on the screen. "I've been looking into Dad's accounts, his emails, the transfers." He gestured toward the papers with a tilt of his chin. Richard stepped forward, confusion pulling him closer. He picked up one of the sheets, his eyes adjusting to the rows of numbers. His throat constricted. His name was at the top, but the balance at the bottom was wrong. So wrong. His life savings, decades of working, scraping, holding the family together, reduced to a mere $12. His hand shook as the paper crumpled in his grip. "This can't be real," he whispered. "It's real," Ethan answered, his voice steady, controlled. "He's been draining the accounts for months. Quietly, carefully. I started noticing patterns, small withdrawals at first, then bigger ones. And 3 weeks ago, he took my college fund. All of it." Richard's knees weakened. He sank into the chair beside the desk, his hands gripping the arms as if to steady the spinning world. His grandson handed him another paper, another blow to the chest. The college account, once holding years of careful savings, now showed 0. Nothing. Empty. The future he had promised Ethan, the future Helen had whispered about on her deathbed. Stolen without hesitation by the boy she had trusted most. "No," Richard breathed, the word breaking as it left him. It was protected. It couldn't just disappear. Ethan finally looked at him, his gaze sharp, unflinching. "It didn't disappear. He moved it, transferred everything into his own account, and then from there, to someone else's, a woman named Veronica." The name landed heavy in the air. Richard stared, disbelief and fury twisting in his chest. "How do you know this?" Ethan turned the screen toward him. Emails opened in long threads, messages between David and the woman, the words cold and incriminating. Plans to move money, instructions for creating new accounts, conversations about starting over somewhere else. Each line was a knife, carving away the remnants of the man Richard had once called his son. "I've been watching," Ethan said, his tone still maddeningly calm. "He wasn't careful. Same passwords for everything. Same habits. He thought nobody was paying attention. But I was, and I've documented everything." Richard's breath came shallow, his chest heavy with rage and sorrow. His own flesh and blood had not only abandoned them, he had gutted their lives, stealing from the father who raised him, from the child who still bore his name. Richard wanted to rise, to shout, to throw something, but the calm in Ethan's voice pinned him to the chair. "Ethan, what are you planning to do with this?" The boy leaned back, folding his hands together as though he had rehearsed the moment. His young face glowed with the light of the laptop, shadow sharp across his features. "I told you I'd handle it, and I will. He thinks he's smarter than us, that he can walk away clean and leave us with nothing. But he's wrong. I have proof, and proof means power." Richard stared, torn between awe and fear. The boy sounded older than his years, speaking with the certainty of someone who had already decided his course. Richard saw Helen in that steadiness, her quiet resilience, but also something new, something forged from betrayal. "What exactly have you found?" Richard asked, his voice low, as though afraid of the answer. Ethan turned back to the screen, pulling up folders labeled with dates and names. Bank records, screenshots, transfers, even messages where David and Veronica laughed about how easy it was to manipulate accounts, to make numbers vanish from one place and reappear in another. Ethan clicked again, and another window appeared. Fraudulent loan applications, credit cards in both Richard's and Ethan's names. Richard's stomach dropped. He used our identities? Ethan nodded once, his expression taut. $30,000 in a personal loan under your name. $15,000 on a card in mine. He lied about my age to get it approved. I've already filed reports, fraud alerts, complaints to the banking commission. They're going to freeze his accounts. Veronica's employer already has evidence of her involvement. It's only a matter of time. Richard's hand shook as he rubbed his face. He had expected betrayal in the form of absence, in the sting of a son walking away. But this was deeper, darker. Theft not only of money, but of identity, of trust, of legacy. And yet, beside him, his grandson spoke of it like a soldier reporting the terrain of a battlefield. Calm, ready, unshaken. "You've done all this?" Richard asked, voice trembling. "Yes," Ethan said simply. "And it's only the beginning." Richard leaned back, staring at him, at the boy whose voice carried the weight of someone far older. He should have been sleeping, dreaming of school and baseball and the ordinary worries of childhood. Instead, he was orchestrating a war against his own father, armed with intelligence, patience, and the fury of betrayal. Richard felt both pride and dread coil in his chest. Pride that Ethan had the strength, the brilliance, to stand against what was happening. Dread that such a weight had fallen on his shoulders at all. The boy should have been shielded from this darkness, not stepping into it head first. He looked again at the screen, at the damning proof, at the neat folder labeled evidence, and a chill ran through him. Ethan wasn't exaggerating. He had enough to dismantle his father's life piece by piece. And from the calm in his tone, Richard realized he intended to do exactly that. For the first time since the suitcase had slammed against the floor, since the photograph had shattered, since David had walked out the door, Richard felt something new. A shift, sharp and unsettling, because now the question wasn't whether they could survive this betrayal. The question was how far Ethan was willing to go, and what kind of man the boy would become once he finished what he had started. The room seemed smaller, suffocating under the glow of the laptop screen. Richard stared at the documents spread across the desk, his throat tight, his pulse hammering. Each page was another knife. Bank statements with his name showing debts he never signed. Credit cards under Ethan's identity, as if his grandson had suddenly aged a decade. And then the emails, lines of text that spelled out betrayal in plain, unashamed words. David and Veronica laughing between themselves, planning, conspiring, weaving lies with the precision of thieves who had no fear of consequence. Ethan's voice cut through the silence, calm but edged with a fury too heavy for 13 years. "He didn't just drain our savings, Grandpa. He used our names. Yours. Mine. He forged everything. $30,000 in your name. $15,000 on a card in mine. He changed my age, made me 25 on paper. He did it all to keep their game running." The boy's jaw tightened as he scrolled, his fingers steady. And Veronica helped every step of the way. She isn't just his girlfriend, she's his partner in crime. Richard's hands curled into fists on his knees. For years he had endured David's silence, his coldness, convincing himself that grief had hollowed his son, that maybe time would heal what loss had fractured. But staring at the proof, there was no grief here. Only greed. Only betrayal so deliberate it felt like a hand around his throat. He thought of Helen again, her tired smile in those final days, the plea in her fading voice. Take care of them. Don't let him lose himself. Richard had promised. And now the boy she had entrusted him with had not just lost himself, he had become something else entirely. A predator feeding on the very family that had carried him through. The anger burned hot, searing through Richard's chest. But beneath it lay something darker. Shame. Shame that he hadn't seen it sooner. Shame that he had clung to the illusion of his son while the man had been stealing from under his roof. Every dollar was more than money. It was time, sacrifice, pieces of his life and Ethan's future. Years of saving from a teacher's pension, years of saying no to himself so he could say yes to his family. And in a few months, David had gutted it all. Richard forced his voice out, though it trembled. Why? Why would he do this to his own family? Ethan didn't look up, his eyes still fixed on the screen. Because he thought he could. Because he thought we were too trusting, too blind to notice. He thought we wouldn't fight back. His tone was steady, but the tightness in his jaw betrayed the storm beneath. But he was wrong. Richard's chest ached as he watched the boy speak, saw the steel in his expression. Ethan should have been broken by this, reduced to tears, crushed under the weight of his father's betrayal. Instead, he sat upright, eyes sharp, voice controlled, cataloging the crimes with the discipline of someone preparing for battle. Richard felt pride and sorrow clash inside him. Pride that the boy carried such strength, sorrow that he had been forced to. He glanced back at the papers, at Veronica's name scattered across emails, at the digital fingerprints left behind like a trail of rot. She had been the whisper in David's ear, the shadow in their home long before Richard ever knew her name. But the truth was clear. David hadn't been tricked or seduced. He had chosen this. He had aligned himself with a thief, a woman who had hollowed out other families, elderly victims who had trusted her, people like Richard himself. And together, they had not hesitated to strip their own blood of dignity and future. Richard pushed himself up from the chair, his knees trembling, his voice low but sharp. He didn't just betray us, Ethan. He betrayed his own son. He betrayed Helen's memory, and he betrayed the man who gave him everything. The words scraped against his throat, heavy with fury. I could forgive weakness. I could forgive grief. But this is theft. This is cruelty. This is him throwing us away like we were nothing. Ethan finally looked at him, his expression unreadable. Then we won't let him get away with it. The simplicity of the statement stopped Richard cold. He studied the boy's face, the steadiness of his gaze. This wasn't bravado. It wasn't a child clinging to hope. It was a vow, forged in betrayal, spoken with a conviction that chilled Richard more than it comforted him. He opened his mouth to respond, but no words came. He saw Helen's eyes in the boy's face, saw the strength she had carried even in her final days, and knew there was no stopping him now. The house groaned in the silence, the weight of the truth pressing heavy against the old walls. Richard sat again, his breath unsteady, his fists still clenched. He wanted to weep, to shout, to tear the night apart. But Ethan's presence kept him still. The boy wasn't unraveling. He was plotting. And Richard realized with a chill that the story wasn't ending here. It was only beginning. The laptop chimed softly, another email appearing on the screen. Ethan's eyes flicked to it, and for the first time that night, a faint smile touched his lips. That'll be the bank, he said calmly. The fraud alert I filed this afternoon is working. His accounts are starting to freeze. Richard blinked, stunned. You did this? Ethan nodded, matter of fact. I filed multiple reports today. Fraud alerts, identity theft complaints. I sent evidence to Veronica's employer. They'll be investigating her by morning. Richard stared at him, caught between pride and fear, his heart pounding with disbelief. The boy who should have been tucked in bed, safe from the ugliness of the world, had instead taken on the weight of justice with the precision of a soldier. His grandson, the boy David had abandoned without hesitation, had become the very architect of his downfall. And Richard, sitting in the glow of the laptop light, realized the fury inside him was no longer only his own. It was alive in Ethan now, sharper, colder, steadier. What had once been despair was transforming into something else entirely, a reckoning. The house fell quiet again, the only sound the soft rhythm of Ethan's typing, each keystroke a nail driven into the coffin of David's deceit. Richard leaned back in the chair, the fury still searing his chest. But for the first time, it carried with it a dangerous new edge. Because if Ethan had already uncovered this much, if he had already set the pieces in motion, then the next question was not whether David would fall. It was how far his own son's betrayal would push a 13-year-old boy, and what kind of justice Ethan truly had in mind when he promised, in that calm, steady voice, that he would handle everything. The glow of the laptop bathed the boy's face in a cold, bluish light, his fingers steady as they danced across the keys. Richard sat in the chair beside him, hands clasped so tightly his knuckles whitened, watching a 13-year-old orchestrate what felt like a war from behind a desk. Ethan's voice was low, calm, matter-of-fact, as he explained each step he had already taken. Fraud alerts filed. Identity theft complaints submitted, screenshots and bank records packaged neatly into evidence folders and sent directly to the authorities. And then the part that made Richard's stomach twist, the emails he had sent to Veronica's employer, exposing her role in laundering money, showing every fraudulent transfer, every manipulated account. Richard felt both pride and dread flood his chest at once. Pride that his grandson had the strength and brilliance to fight back. Dread that the boy's battlefield was one no child should ever stand on. "You did all this today?" Richard asked, his voice rough, almost disbelieving. Ethan nodded without hesitation. "Yes. I made sure Dad's accounts are flagged, so he won't be able to move anything without someone noticing. And Veronica, her career is over. They'll have no choice but to investigate her. I've built a case they can't ignore." Richard exhaled, the sound shaking in his throat. He thought of Ethan just hours earlier, sitting at that old oak desk with his algebra book open, the picture of innocence. Now here he was, waging digital warfare against the very man who had fathered him, against the woman who had torn their lives apart. Richard rubbed his temples, the weight of it pressing into him. He should have been the one fighting this battle, the one carrying the burden. Instead, his grandson had stepped into the fire without flinching. "Ethan," Richard said softly, "this isn't a game. You're dealing with criminals, with people who won't hesitate to destroy everything to save themselves." The boy finally looked at him, his gaze sharp, steady in a way that unsettled Richard. "I know. That's why I have to do it right. That's why I can't leave it half-finished." He turned back to the screen, clicking through folders labeled with precision. Each document, each file, was another strike against his father, another nail driven into the coffin of betrayal. Richard leaned back, his chest tightening. The pride inside him swelled with every keystroke, seeing his grandson so capable, so determined. But the fear was just as strong. What would this do to the boy? What kind of man would Ethan become, carrying the knowledge that he had dismantled his own father's life piece by piece? Richard thought of Helen again, her soft voice, her hope that their family would endure. Would she have been proud of this moment or horrified? He didn't know. He only knew that the boy had made his choice, and there was no pulling him back. The laptop chimed again, a new message sliding across the screen. Ethan's lips twitched into the faintest smile. "Veronica's been suspended from Meridian Financial," he said, the words quiet but laced with satisfaction. "The investigation starts tomorrow." Richard felt the room spin. He had expected consequences to come slowly, if at all, tangled in bureaucracy. But here was proof, already in motion, triggered by the relentless will of a boy too young to vote, too young to drive, yet somehow old enough to dismantle the empire his father thought he had built in secret. "Ethan," Richard whispered, "do you realize what you've done?" The boy's expression didn't falter. "I protected us. Dad thought we were helpless. He thought we'd just let him walk away with everything. He was wrong. I made sure of it." His voice carried no bravado, no arrogance, just cold certainty. Richard swallowed hard, torn between the swell of pride and the chill of unease. He wanted to hug the boy, to tell him how proud he was, how much strength it took to stand up when adults had failed him. But another part of him wanted to pull Ethan away from the screen, shut the laptop, lock it all away before it consumed him. Because this wasn't just survival anymore. It was vengeance. It was justice, yes, but it was sharp-edged, dangerous, and Richard wasn't sure how far Ethan would go before he stopped. The furnace hummed to life, filling the silence with its steady drone, but the house felt colder than ever. Richard looked around the room, the stacks of papers, the neat folders, the evidence of a child forced to become a soldier, and wondered how they had come to this. A father's betrayal had turned his grandson into something both remarkable and frightening. "Grandpa," Ethan said suddenly, breaking into his thoughts, "you don't have to worry anymore. I've set things in motion. They can't undo it now. Even if Dad tries to run, he won't get far. And Veronica, she'll never steal from another family again." Richard's throat tightened. He wanted to believe, wanted to let those words carry him into sleep. But instead, they left him more restless than before. Because if Ethan was capable of all this, capable of unraveling two adults with nothing but intelligence and determination, then the question clawing at the back of Richard's mind was no longer whether they would survive. It was what his grandson was becoming, forged in betrayal, tempered in anger, and whether the man Ethan would grow into would ever know the ease of being a child again. And as the boy turned back to his screen, his face lit in the cold glow of victory, Richard felt the unshakable truth settle over him. This was only the beginning. Richard sat heavy in the old chair, his breath shallow. The future stretched out before him like a fog-bound road with no end. Every calculation came up empty. Savings gone, the college fund erased, debts piled in his name. He had never touched. He had carried the family for years, held them together with the stubbornness of a man who refused to quit. But tonight the weight felt unbearable. His son had gutted everything, and all Richard could see ahead was a slow, grinding collapse into nothing. Then Ethan lifted his head from the glow of the laptop, eyes sharp, jaw set, and spoke with a certainty that sliced through the haze. "We'll get it all back," he said. 4 words, quiet but unyielding. Words that didn't belong to a boy, but to a soldier. Richard blinked, and for the first time since the suitcase slammed against the floor, something flickered inside him. Hope. Fragile, yes, but real. Warming his chest, like a match struck in the dark. He studied Ethan's face, the hard line of his mouth, the calm in his eyes, and felt a surge of disbelief. How could a child carry such conviction when all Richard saw was ruin? But the boy's voice left no room for doubt. "We'll get it back," Ethan repeated, each syllable measured, grounded in certainty. Richard's throat tightened. He wanted to believe, wanted to let those words carry him out of despair. But another part of him hesitated, afraid to lean too heavily on a promise made by someone so young. Still, as he looked at his grandson, he couldn't deny it. There was something unshakable in him, something carved out of betrayal and fire. "Ethan," Richard whispered, his voice brittle, "how can you be so sure?" The boy didn't flinch. He tapped the laptop, folders neatly stacked, documents lined like ammunition. "Because he made mistakes. Because he left a trail. And because I know how to use it." His tone was calm, stripped of hesitation, and it sent a chill through Richard even as it stirred his pride. He leaned back, closing his eyes for a moment, letting the words sink in. Maybe Helen had been right all along. Maybe the strength to survive wasn't always in the parent, but sometimes in the child. The night stretched long, shadows clinging to the corners of the room, but that ember of hope refused to die. Richard watched as Ethan returned to work, scanning through emails, cross-referencing transactions, building something larger than just a case. He was building a counterattack. Each keystroke echoed like a drumbeat of war, and Richard realized he wasn't just watching a boy at a desk. He was watching the rebirth of their future, piece by piece. He thought of Helen again, of her tired eyes as she pressed his hand years ago, begging him not to let David drown. He had failed that promise, failed to keep his son from falling into darkness. But looking at Ethan now, Richard felt another vow rising inside him. He would not fail this boy. He would not let Ethan stand alone on the battlefield he had chosen. He would be there however he could, even if his role was only to remind him that beneath all the fury, beneath the justice, there was still a child worth saving. Outside, the October wind howled against the windows, rattling the old house. Richard glanced at the cracked photo of Helen on the dresser, her smile undimmed despite the fracture slicing through the glass. He wondered what she would think if she were here. Would she be proud, heartbroken? Both, perhaps, because Ethan was her legacy as much as David was, and though one son had chosen betrayal, the other, the grandson, had chosen defiance. "Grandpa," Ethan said suddenly, breaking into his thoughts, "we're not just going to survive this. We're going to win." His voice was steady, his eyes locked on Richard's with a certainty that left no space for doubt. Richard nodded slowly, the knot in his chest loosening. For the first time in days, he allowed himself to breathe deeply, to imagine that tomorrow might hold more than loss. He reached across the desk, placing his weathered hand over Ethan's. "Then we'll do it together," he said, his voice low but firm. Ethan's lips curved into the faintest smile. Together. The furnace hummed in the background, the clock ticked steadily, but the silence no longer felt suffocating. Instead, it felt charged, alive, like the moment before a storm breaks. Richard sat back, watching his grandson's determination burn in the glow of the screen, and let the warmth of that fragile fire spread through him. He knew the battle ahead would be brutal, knew the scars of betrayal would not fade easily. But tonight, in this house scarred by absence, there was something stronger than despair. There was a boy who refused to be broken, and in that refusal, Richard found the strength to rise again. Still, beneath the fragile calm, a question lingered in his mind, one that pulsed with equal parts pride and unease. If Ethan was certain they would get everything back, if he was so confident in the war he had already begun, then what exactly was his plan? And how far was he willing to go to make sure victory was theirs? Life has a way of testing us in the places we least expect, sometimes not from strangers, but from the very people we raised and trusted most. Richard's story is painful, but inside it lies a truth many older Americans understand deeply. Betrayal can wound, but it does not have to define the rest of our days. When his son walked away and stripped him of everything he had built, hope seemed lost. Yet from that loss came something unexpected, his grandson's resilience, courage, and determination to fight back. The lesson is simple but powerful. Even when we feel broken, there may be strength waiting to rise in the next generation. For those of us in our later years, it is a reminder that dignity is not measured by money stolen or promises broken, but by how we face the storm and who stands with us when it passes. Trust can be shattered, but faith in family, in justice, in the values we lived our lives by, can still carry us forward. And sometimes, the light that keeps us going is not our own, but the fire we see burning in those we love.